Vampire films have fascinated audiences for generations, from Max Schreck's portrayal of Count Orlok in Nosferatu to Bela Lugosi's unforgettable performance in Dracula. However, only a few actors have left as lasting an impact as Christopher Lee. With his commanding presence, Lee redefined Count Dracula for a new era in the Hammer horror films, blending sophistication with terror. So join me as I explore 20 facts about Christopher Lee's iconic performance as Count Dracula, from his introduction to Hammer Studios to his enduring legacy, and why I consider him to be the greatest actor to have played Count Dracula. This is Horror Facts. Number 1. Introduction to Hammer films. Christopher Lee was introduced to Hammer when he was cast as the monster in The Curse of Frankenstein, although in this movie he's referred to as the Creature. His imposing height and deep voice caught Hammer's attention, leading to his casting as Count Dracula in Dracula, although in the US it was titled Horror of Dracula. Number 2. Reluctant star. Lee took on the role of Dracula for Hammer reluctantly. He wasn't initially drawn to playing vampires, but saw it as a way to make a name in film. Over time, he became famous for his portrayal of the Count, playing him 7 times for Hammer. Number 3. Expert knowledge of the novel. Christopher Lee was an avid reader of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
He was deathly pale, just like a waxen image, and the red eyes glared with a horrible, vindictive look which I knew too well.
He was often frustrated that Hammer's scripts didn't adhere closely to the novel. When given interviews, he often had this to say.
This was a great fight I used to have over the years with Hammer. I kept on saying, why don't you use Stoker's words, Stoker's dialogue, if you like.
Christopher Lee really fought for Stoker's language to be included in the films, though Hammer often chose more sensational material for their scripts. Number 4. Vlad the Impaler. Lee had a deep interest in the historical inspiration behind Dracula. He would often discuss the real-life tyrant and his atrocities in interviews, showing his knowledge of the historical figure that influenced Stoker's character.
I've been to the country where he lived, I've been to the ruins of his castle, I have seen the monasteries and been there that he endowed, and I can assure every one of you who is listening or who is watching that Vlad Tepes Dracula did exist.
Number 5. Refusal to speak in Dracula Prince of Darkness. Lee famously refused to speak any lines in Dracula Prince of Darkness because he found them unspeakable.
And then they did the second one, and I didn't speak at all. Not at all. And people have often wondered why I've been struck dumb or something. It was simply because I read the script and I said, I can't say any of these lines. It was just impossible.
So I said, I'm sorry, I'm not saying these lines. You know, you get a terrific laugh, which I'm quite convinced we would have done.
Number 6. Turning down later films. Christopher Lee only initially signed on for the first 2 Dracula movies. He then later turned down Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, Dracula AD 1972, and The Satanic Rites of Dracula. He felt that the character had been poorly written in all of those films, devoid of the complexity he loved in Stoker's version.
I turned down all but the first 2. There was a gap of 7 or 8 years between the first and the second, in which I didn't speak at all. Then I made whatever it was, 4 more, I think, 3 or 4 more, I can't remember, over the years. Every single one of those stories I turned down and said, no, I will not do it. I don't like the story. It's nothing to do with the character, and I don't want to play the part anymore. I can't do anything more with it.
Number 7. Returning for the crew. Though Lee disliked how Hammer was treating the character of Dracula, he returned out of loyalty to the crew. Hammer convinced him to reprise the role, citing the number of jobs that would be lost if he didn't. Lee had this to say.
And I got hysterical telephone calls from Hammer saying, what's this I hear about you saying you won't do this? It's happened 3 times. I said, no, I'm not happy to do it. I don't have to. I don't want to. You've got to. You've got to. You have to. You must. Why? which perhaps was a foolish question. The answer I got was, because we've already sold the film to the American distributor with you in the role, otherwise they weren't interested. And here comes the crunch. Think of the people you'll put out of work if you don't do it. So what do? Am I going to be held responsible for putting 90 to 100 people out of work? Actors, actresses, directors, writers, producers, technicians. How could I? So I did them. And that is the only reason why. It certainly wasn't for money.
Number 8. Minimal dialogue in the series. In most of his Hammer Dracula films, Lee had minimal dialogue. This was sometimes by choice and sometimes due to script constraints. His Dracula relied heavily on physical presence and menace, with fewer words than expected. Number 9. Christopher Lee's relationship with Peter Cushing. Lee and Peter Cushing, who played Van Helsing, developed a deep friendship off-screen. Despite playing mortal enemies in the Dracula films, they were very close, often seen laughing and joking between takes.
I don't know what one of us had said to the other. Probably we'd been doing Yosemite Sam or Sylvester the Cat or something like that, because we both loved those films. But this was on the set of The Gorgon in 1965. I obviously, as you can see, wasn't dressed for the scene. Peter, I don't even have to add his second name, Peter was.
The first time that Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing shared a scene together was in The Curse of Frankenstein.
The story does go that I first met Christopher in that makeup you just saw. And at lunchtime he took it off, and when he came into the restaurant I screamed.
Number 10. Complexity of Count Dracula. Lee often expressed disappointment that Hammer's version of Dracula didn't fully explore the complexity of the character. He believed Dracula was more than a monster, referring to Stoker's depiction as a man of high intelligence, culture, and malevolence.
I became progressively disenchanted. I said, look, this has nothing to do with Stoker's book, nothing to do with Stoker's character. You're writing the story first and trying to fit the character in afterwards, which is exactly the wrong way of going about it. I felt that the presentation of the character was getting further and further and further away from what Bram Stoker had in mind when he wrote the book.
Yeah.
The stories were getting further and further away. They even brought two into the modern period. And eventually I said, look, this is enough.
Number 11. Lee's first appearance as Dracula. Christopher Lee's introduction as Dracula in Hammer's first Dracula movie is remembered for his aristocratic demeanour. In his first scene, he is calm and polite, setting a trap for Jonathan Harker, who goes to work for Dracula as his librarian. But Jonathan Harker is aware that Dracula is a vampire and goes there to destroy him. The first time we see Christopher Lee as Count Dracula is just so unforgettable. He's standing at the top of the stairs, and even the way he walks down the stairs, he has such a presence. Number 12. Lee's baritone voice. Though he was mostly silent in many of the Dracula films, Lee's baritone voice was one of his greatest assets. His voice commanded authority, adding depth to his portrayal of Dracula when he did speak. In the Satanic Rites of Dracula, Dracula has a lot of dialogue, and he actually gets to project his voice in a way that we've never heard it before.
4 horsemen of my created apocalypse. 4 carriers of the plague who will infect their miserable brethren. You, Van Helsing, are now one of the 4. My revenge has spread over centuries and has just begun.
Number 13. Physical performance. Christopher Lee's towering height at 6'5" and intense gaze made him a natural fit for Dracula. His physicality became one of the defining traits of his portrayal, with Dracula being more of a silent predator than a verbose villain. Number 14. Stunt work. Christopher Lee was involved in some of the more dangerous scenes in the Dracula films, but stunt doubles often took over for the most perilous moments. For example, when it came time to shooting Dracula's death scene in Dracula Prince of Darkness, Christopher Lee's stunt double, Eddie Powell, almost drowned. Number 15. The Dracula Ring. In all of Lee's Hammer Dracula performances, you'll notice that he wears a silver ring. The ring was a copy of Bela Lugosi's ring in the 1931 production of Dracula. Christopher Lee wore the ring as a homage to Lugosi.
I was given this signet ring, a duplicate of the ring worn by Lugosi when he played Dracula. I wore it in all subsequent films in which I played the character out of respect for Bram Stoker, for fans around the world, and of course, my predecessor.
Number 16. Popularity despite reservations. Even though Christopher Lee wasn't fond of many of the Dracula films, his portrayal was beloved by fans. He once admitted he was surprised by the enduring popularity of his version of the Count.
Well, some of the films have been accepted as classics, I gather. I wouldn't have thought the last two, but maybe the other two or three were obviously entertaining, were very well accepted, very well received, and the audience enjoyed them. I have to be honest and say that I didn't.
Number 17. Playing Count Dracula and other vampires in non-Hammer productions. Christopher Lee didn't just take the role of the classic vampire for Hammer Productions, he played Dracula and other vampire characters in other films. Some of these roles were short appearances and some were full performances. Those films are Uncle Was a Vampire, released in 1959, The Magic Christian, released in 1969, Count Dracula, released in 1970, One More Time, also 1970, and finally Dracula and Son, released in 1976. Uncle Was a Vampire is an Italian comedy stroke horror film. Lee doesn't play Dracula exactly, he's a Dracula-type character. His name in the film is Baron Rodrigo da Frankerton. Technically, this would be Christopher Lee's second time playing a vampire on screen, as this film came a year after Hammer released their first Dracula film. In The Magic Christian, Christopher Lee's short role is credited as the ship's vampire. Not Dracula, but it still counts as he's playing a vampire on screen. Count Dracula, directed by Jesus Franco, is probably Christopher Lee's best known Dracula role outside of Hammer. This film surprisingly sticks closer to Bram Stoker's novel. When we first see Dracula, he is an older man and looks how he was described in the book. Throughout the film, Dracula gets younger, and I believe that this is the performance that Christopher Lee wanted to play when he approached the role of Dracula. In the film One More Time, Lee plays Count Dracula according to Wikipedia at least, but this role is more of a cameo as he's left uncredited. The most exciting thing about this cameo is that Christopher Lee is seen alongside Peter Cushing, who cameos as Baron Frankenstein. Much like Lee, Cushing is left uncredited.
Aha! We have a visitor. Won't you join our little party?
And finally, Lee's last on-screen appearance as Count Dracula was in the French comedy movie titled Dracula and Son. So technically, Christopher Lee is the only actor who has played a vampire on screen more times than any other actor, in total 12 times. Number 18. Returning to Hammer Horror after 8 years. Christopher Lee returned to the Dracula role in Dracula Prince of Darkness after an 8-year absence. The film capitalised on his earlier success but did little to evolve the character. Although with that being said, Dracula Prince of Darkness happens to be my favourite movie in the Hammer Dracula series, and is my favourite Hammer horror movie. The film introduced me to Hammer horror and Christopher Lee as Count Dracula, and soon enough it would become clear that Christopher Lee would become my all-time favourite version of Dracula, and I'm almost certain it will forever stay that way.
Charming. Charming.
Number 19. Cinematic Legacy. Much like Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee left an indelible mark on the genre. His portrayal became the archetype for the character, and this would lead to future depictions of Dracula in film and television. He was a new Dracula for a new era, and still remains a fan favourite. And finally, number 20. Christopher Lee's final performance as Count Dracula. Now, technically speaking, the last time Christopher Lee would play the Count was in the 1976 parody movie Dracula and Son. But when talking about Hammer Productions, Lee's last outing as Dracula was in The Satanic Rites of Dracula, released in the year 1973. The film was not well received, and in my opinion, it is the worst Hammer Dracula movie. Even though the film isn't great, both Lee and Cushing still give it their all. With his consistent rejections with Hammer over the years of playing the character, I'm sure he was glad that he didn't have to come back to the role. Many people think that Christopher Lee might have been typecast as Dracula, but that's not true. As Christopher Lee puts it,
I have quite definitely proved a great many people wrong. The people who said, you only do horror movies. You can't escape from Dracula. Some idiot put that in the paper on Sunday. They said Christopher Lee cannot escape the curse of Dracula. The person who wrote that is never going to be able to escape the curse of being thought a complete idiot for having written something like that, because it isn't true. And the proof is on the screen.